In this video we're going to be looking at Microsoft Codename Neptune. Now Neptune is not actually part of the XP development process as such. However, it is very important when looking at the development process, and you'll see why during the video. Now, only one build of Neptune was ever released to testers, and that was build 5111, and that was released during December 1999. Now, the first known build of Whistler, which was the code name for Windows XP, was released on the 2nd of February 2000, and that was build 2202. So really, this build of Neptune that we know about is less than 2 months preceding the first XP build that we know about, or the first Whistler build that we know about. Now, if you don't know much about the Neptune project, basically it was a project to create a consumer version of Windows 2000. Now, Windows 2000 was targeted at businesses. It was based on NT, which at the time was Microsoft's business operating system base, shall we say. So with Neptune, what they really wanted to do was create a version of Windows NT for consumers. So it was effectively going to be the home edition of Windows 2000. Now that didn't work out. They changed their plans, and we got Whistler instead. Now, I'd encourage you to go away and read up about this to get some background. I'd also encourage you to look at the development of XP introduction and overview video, which I posted, and will be before this video in the playlist, just so you can get some idea of the background. Okay, so Neptune was going to have an NT version of 5.5, and the other thing we know is that build 5111 was the milestone 2 build, and it was a developer release build. So I'll show you the setup process to start. So as you can see, it's not a surprise that it looks exactly like a Windows NT setup process, as you'd expect, really. You notice that it's just called Neptune. It's not called Windows Neptune. Now on the boot screen it's called Microsoft Neptune, so it's slightly inconsistent, but it's usually known as Windows Neptune nowadays. And it's calling itself Windows 2000 at this stage. Now, as I say, there are a lot of things about Neptune which are really interesting and actually integral to the development of XP, but as I say, it wasn't part of the Whistler project. Okay, setup's just finished copying files now. Okay, the system is rebooted now, and we're at the boot screen. Now, as you can see, this is very similar to Windows 2000 boot screen. And again, as I say, on the boot screen it's identifying itself as Neptune, with no mention of it being Windows related, although obviously it is Windows related. Okay, now interestingly, this is the second part of the Neptune installation process, and it's different. It's different to the 9X installation process, and it's different to the Windows 2000 installation process. Now, interestingly, due to the version number of this build, which is NT 5.5, if you take the CD with Neptune on and you insert it into a computer running Windows XP, you'll get a message saying that the CD-ROM contains a newer version of Windows than the one you're presently using. Would you like to upgrade? Now, XP's version number is 5.1 and Neptune is 5.5, so that's the reason that you get that discrepancy. Right, so we're at the start of the setup wizard now. Now this is very Windows 2000-esque, this part. Alright, so fairly expectantly, we're now at the stage where we're asked for locale settings. And this happens in virtually every Windows install process, if not every Windows install process. So it's not a surprise. And again, it's just identical, really. Same dialog boxes, same options. And again, name and organisation, and computer name. Now I think originally this build did require a product key, but during the mists of time, one or more persons have removed that requirement, which is quite helpful. Right, so we're on to essentially the last stage of setup now. Okay, now at this point setup will finish and the machine will be rebooted and you'll get the boot screen and you'll boot into the desktop. However, sometimes setup will crash. Now I'm not sure why that happens. Hold on, I'll just recapture the video for you. So as I say, I'm not sure why that happens sometimes. Now it's happened to me most times I've tried to install Neptune, and what I've actually had to do in the past is actually switch virtualization software, and I find that it works better with VMware than it does with VirtualBox. Now what I've done this time is I've loaded a machine in VirtualBox that I've already got running, which happened to work perfectly when I installed it on this occasion, so I've kept it, and I've reset all the settings to default. So this is essentially what you would get on your first boot up after setup. Now you will notice that it's stalling at preparing network connections, which is something that I think is known about. It's obviously some sort of problem in Neptune, but it does eventually carry on and get there. There's also an issue with Explorer, so sometimes you'll have to wait quite a while for the start menu and taskbar and icons to appear on the desktop. And now apparently that's to do with some malfunctioning service that's set to automatically run at startup, and you can turn it off. I can't remember exactly what service it is at the moment, but I think you can find out. You can probably find out about it online. Yeah, so mine hasn't done that this time. So this is essentially what you get on first boot up. Now you'll notice I've changed the mouse cursor style, which is insignificant. I've installed Opera, which is again insignificant. I've also installed VirtualBox additions, which gives you nicer, you can put the color depth up, etc. Now the other thing I did do was I upgraded IE to IE6, which is the latest version that will work with Neptune. So I'll show you around the interface. So this is all bog standard customizations that you'd expect to get. There's nothing new here at all. There's no visual styles. Obviously that came with XP later on. Start menu, again typical. Again you'll notice it's calling itself Microsoft Neptune. Now I find that rather peculiar that it's not calling itself Windows Neptune. I don't think that Whistler ever called itself Microsoft Whistler. It was always either Codename Whistler or Windows Whistler, so I don't understand that. And this is Explorer. Now on first glance it's identical to Explorer in Me and 2000, but if you look at the design of the web elements here, you'll notice that this is actually different. We've got some orange stripy bars in Neptune, and again we've got them here as well, so that is slightly different, but everything else about Explorer is as you'd expect as far as I'm aware. Yeah, so that's Explorer. So I'll show you the version number. Now you'll notice here it's identifying itself as version 5.0, but that's actually incorrect. It is, the kernel version is 5.5, and again they're 5.0, but if you look at the file properties you'll find that it is actually 5.5, so that's again a discrepancy. Now the reason that Neptune is so significant for the development of XP is a lot of features that were introduced in Neptune have found their way into XP. So for example, I'll show you some of them now. The first one is the integrated Windows firewall. Now in Neptune, here is where the option is for the firewall. It's in the properties for your network connections, and it's specific to each connection that you've got, and it's virtually a tick box. There are no other settings, even though this does appear. It's nothing to do with the firewall really. So you check the box, you press OK, and that's your integrated firewall turned on for that connection. As I say, it's not attached to the user interface at all. There's no icon in the control panel for it, but it is there and it does function. And obviously that was first introduced with XP. Now the other thing is we actually get a logon screen, or a welcome screen. Interestingly, you don't get the welcome screen on boot up, or at least you don't if you're the only user. I haven't tried it with multiple users, but I actually have to log off to see mine. And since I upgraded to IE6, I've also got a slight delay with it appearing, but it does eventually appear. Here it is. So we've got a guest account which we can't turn off. We have this option to turn off the computer, and that works. I haven't tried the restart yet with the shift, but this is the welcome screen in Neptune, which again was carried over into XP, but obviously it is a lot different in XP. But the idea, as far as I'm aware, came from Neptune. Now again, as you'd expect, you've got things like file a bug report, and this is, I think, identical to the one that I looked at in one of the Whistler videos. Windows Update. Now this is interesting. Windows Update, you'll actually get to the Windows Update page and it will attempt to find updates for you, but then you'll get this message. So it doesn't work. However, you can get to the Windows Update page. Now if you try and do that now with, for example, me or 98 or 95, you'll end up in an endless loop where it redirects you again and again to a different page, and you never actually get to Windows Update. And I think that's deliberate, that Microsoft have done that now to stop the old operating systems being able to be updated, because it's only happened recently, and it's happened to me in more than one of my virtual machines on different PCs as well. So I think that's not just an issue that I'm having. Yeah, again, personalization things like mouse pointers are, or as you'd expect. Again with sounds, we've got the Windows 2000/me sounds, so there's nothing new there. I'll show you the Windows components. Okay, so that's pretty basic as well. We get games, which you don't get in Windows 2000, as far as I'm aware. So that's obviously an attempt to make this consumer orientated. Now another interesting thing is in power options, which you may find peculiar, and it's here, this power off setting. Now I've turned this off, but by default there's a tick in that box, and essentially what happens is when you press power off in the start menu, the system will hibernate. So hibernate is actually turned on by default in Neptune. It's not referenced as hibernate, but save states on power off is what hibernate does. And when that's ticked and you press power off, you'll get a box saying preparing to hibernate. Now the other interesting thing about Neptune is this fast startup thing. Now I haven't been able to try it out because I installed it to an NTFS partition, but if I installed it to a FAT partition, I'd have this fast startup option. And I find that really interesting now as well, because I don't know whether you know or not, but in Windows 8, one of the key things that Microsoft have done is introduce a fast startup option, which I would imagine works in a similar way to this, although I'm not sure. But I find that really interesting. Right, so back to the user accounts. They're known as Windows identities on Neptune, and again, really interesting. This is a lot like the user accounts control panel in XP. And you can see that it's a bit odd. It doesn't fit in with any other part of the interface on Neptune. It's got this sort of bluey purple sidebar and a nice italicized title there, which doesn't match anything else in the user interface. So we've got options to change accounts, make new ones and delete them, change pictures. I'll show you the picture selection. They're not very interesting. There are a lot of flowers for some reason, which is peculiar. Change name, change account type, change password. Now account types, again this is interesting. Now there are 4 options on Neptune. We've got the owner option, which is basically the administrator. Then we've got adult. Okay, This type of account is intended for people who can make standard changes to the computer, but such as installing application hardware. Then we've got child, okay, intended for children whose computer activity should be monitored and who should be safeguarded against corrupting computer settings and deleting important files. Have limited access to internet content and can have limited computer usage time. A person with a child account can only change his or her own account name and picture, and guest. So again, you can see this is a big attempt at a big attempt at marketing this at the consumer market. So that's interesting as well. Okay, now the other thing, yeah, that's interesting in Neptune, or another thing that's interesting in Neptune, I'll have to find it because it's not attached to the interface anywhere. I'm just trying to remember where this is actually. It might be this. Yeah, auto update. So you can see that this is actually, in hindsight, a precursor to Windows Update, the integrated Windows Update that you get in XP. Now it's called Auto Update here, and it says it's a new feature which will allow you to keep your computer up to date without requiring you to search for new components and information. Now to get to this in Neptune, you have to do what I just did. You have to go to the Windows folder and click it manually yourself. It's not attached to any user interface, it's not in the control panel. And again, we've got the options which are very similar to the ones you get in XP. Notify me when updates are ready, notify me when they're available to download, and again before you install them, and do not automatically update my computer. And it'll ask you about that, but it doesn't do anything after that. So it doesn't work, but it's there. Now, there are a couple more things, and I'm just wondering what order would make more sense to show them in. The first one is, again, something which is not attached to the user interface, but you can attach it manually. And I shall explain this in a second. Right, now I've just typed that command in, and that will activate a user interface feature that was supposed to be in Neptune, but it wasn't actually complete at the time of the compilation of this build. But by running that command, you get the files for it, and you can get a sense of what it was meant to be about. Now, you might not think this looks very interesting, but if I show you this, okay. Now, as far as we are aware, this is the way that this functionality was supposed to be delivered. Now, it's called Activity Centers. Now, you'll notice at the top here it's got Windows Codename Millennium, and that's because the Activity Centers are also found in early builds of Windows Millennium Edition, and it looks like it was just carried over from there at this point. Now, Activity Centers is an experimental user interface, and it was something that Microsoft, I guess, thought of for Neptune, because obviously this was meant to be the first version of NT that was going to be marketed at consumers, and these sorts of things, these task-centered operations for consumers would be a really useful thing. Now, for example, if I click on email, I want to read and send messages, it'll launch Outlook Express for me. Perhaps unfortunately, but it does. If I click search the web, etc., it'll launch IE for me, again perhaps unfortunately. If I click documents, it'll take me to WordPad. Now I find that one a bit peculiar. I would have imagined that I'd just gone to my documents folder, but that takes you to WordPad. And music, photos and games, they don't take you anywhere, and that's because, as I say, this feature, the activity centers, aren't complete in this build of Neptune, and we don't know whether they were ever completed actually. But what was meant to happen at this point is it would take you to a program, in this case Media Center, which has not been created by this build. Now the programs were not really programs. They were HTML pages, web pages, that were meant to act like they were programs, and I'll explain that more in a minute. So that's the same for photos as well, Photo Center, and games, Game Center. Help and support will take you to help and support. And there are just a lot of things here that you can identify as being an XP, like the recent programs list, which is in the XP start menu here. So that's something that ended up in XP. And things like the Game Center wasn't in XP, but if you think of the Game Center in Vista and Windows 7, I would imagine that this would have been remarkably similar. So it's really interesting that a lot of these things seem to tie in with later additions to Windows. Now, this is the customization settings. Now you've got different themes. I changed mine. This is the default theme, which, as you can see, ties in with the Explorer web elements quite nicely. And you get the option to add different things to your starting places, or remove some of them if you want to. You can turn off the recent programs section. You can add things or delete them here as you wish. Okay, and that functionality works, and if you double click these icons you'll get to the program, so that functionality works as well. Now, as I say, it's not made apparent how activity centers were supposed to be integrated into the user interface, but it has been assumed that they were supposed to be displayed as an active desktop element, as I've done here, and possibly to fill the entire desktop, so I don't even have my icons, but as I say, it's not sure because it wasn't completed. Now, as I say, the music, photo and game programs haven't been completed, but we do have the HTML pages which would have run inside that pseudo program, shall we say. So if I click on home, for example, you can see just a little bit of what the music center was supposed to look like. Now it'll open an Opera on here because it's a HTML page, and you can see the sort of options that you get. Now this sort of functionality came in Windows Media Player later on, so that's really interesting, and I'll show you the Game Center as well. Okay, so this is the Game Center, and obviously the games are meant to be displayed on this side, but that's not working. And again, this is just remarkably similar to the Game Center in Vista and 7. I just find it fascinating. Now the Photo Center, it doesn't actually work when I launch it, and I'm not going to click it for that reason. Actually, I haven't tried it in Opera, so it might work this time. But it crashed, i.e. Ah, here we go. So this is the Photo Center. Right, I've come back to the desktop now. Now I've turned off the desktop icons, and I've maximised the active desktop window showing the Activity Center homepage, just to give you an idea really of what maybe this was supposed to look like in the user interface. Now I'd imagine that on your first boot up this would be on your desktop and you'd have no icons, because as you can see the default desktop icons are all here. We've got My Computer, My Documents, Recycle and our Network Places, so I'll imagine that that's where you'd find them, and again IE, Outlook Express, etc. would be there, and they're also down in the quick launch by default. So, and again I say we don't know, but I'd imagine that this is how this was meant to work, and it's just a really nice consumer orientated way of introducing different features of the operating system, which is, you know, quite a nice thing to do, I think. Right, so in the next part of the video I'm gonna show you some screenshots of the activity centers working, which have been forwarded to me by a YouTube user really kindly, called Mr. Ken Hanna on YouTube. I'll put a link to his channel in the description. Now Ken has been working on for a long time actually trying to restore the functionality of the activity centers in Neptune. And like I say, he spent many years doing that, and he's actually come up with, as far as I'm aware, quite a well-functioning sort of reconstruction, shall we say, of the activity centers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a slideshow of what I think are some of the most interesting screenshots that Ken has, as I say, kindly sent to me, for you to just have a look at and get an idea of how the activity centers were supposed to look and feel, really, if Neptune did ever come to fruition. So this has been a video showing Microsoft Neptune. I've placed a lot of emphasis on the activity centers because I think that's one of the most interesting and fascinating things really about the Neptune project, and the fact that you can find references to the activity center ideas in a lot of post-Neptune Windows systems. As I say, the Game Center in Vista and 7 I would imagine is very similar to this one, would have been. And things like the Music Center, you've got Windows Media Player, you've also got Windows Media Center, for example. I just find it really interesting that, you know, the recent programs list as well on XP, and Vista and 7. It's just really interesting to see how much of this could have actually begun with Neptune without us really realising. And it's a shame actually that we don't have a build of Neptune where the activity centres are completed. I mean, we don't even know if they were completed. The project may well have been abandoned before that ever came to fruition. But as I say, it's really interesting anyway. And other things like the welcome screen, the firewall, which were all found in XP and later versions of Windows. So again, it's just really interesting. So just to wrap up really quickly, some other things we do know. There was at least one other build of Neptune compiled, and that was build 5022. And the reason we know that is because there are files in some of the early Millennium Edition builds which are borrowed from that build of Neptune, so we know that one existed. Now it's rumoured that another build also existed called build 5000, but there's no proof of that as far as I'm aware, so take that with a pinch of salt, I think. Yeah, so really a lot of the Neptune work underpins the development of XP, and as I said in the introductory video, the team that worked on Neptune were combined with another team working on the then planned business version of NT. They were combined together to work on the Whistler project, so the people that were working on Neptune did actually have the input in XP, and I would imagine that's where a lot of the similarities come from. Yeah, so in the next video I'm going to be looking at the earliest Whistler build that we know of, and that's build 2202, which as I say is from February 2000. Otherwise, thanks for watching the video, hope you found it as interesting as I did, and I'll see you in the next video.